Trials and Triumphs,
Any
a
promise
program
not-
that takes a hard look at the hard topics with Pastor Ladina Boo.
Good morning. My name's Ladina Boo from Stockton, Missouri, and I want to thank you for joining me on Trials and Triumphs today on July the 16th, 2024. At the moment, we're discussing the transing of our children and what our school systems and state laws have to say about the situation with regard to athletics. My personal opinion, as most of you know, is that no child is born in the wrong body. And to feed into that particular delusion and start puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones on a child is nothing short of child abuse. We need to let our kids be kids and stop this rush to do something that is going to physically harm them and turn them into permanent patients at best or kill them at worst. As I said before, and on many occasions, you cannot turn a boy into a girl, and you cannot turn a girl into the boy. At this point, we're discussing the various states and how they deal with trans athletes. The Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, GLSEN, and transathlete.com have done various research on the various states as to how they deal with transgender athletes. I want to continue this week and get through the remainder of the states and how they deal with this particular topic, and specifically whether transgender girls, formerly boys, are allowed to compete on the women's sports teams. Transathlete.com and GLSEN considers Nebraska to be a discriminatory state. The Nebraska School Activities Association, NSAA, requires transgender students wishing to participate in athletics to show evidence of hormone therapy or gender reassignment surgery to demonstrate a consistent gender identity. The policy also calls for a review by an NSAA committee in cases of transgender girls. I don't consider this discriminatory. I consider it a smart move to avoid having males in our daughters' restrooms and or locker rooms. Nevada. The Nevada Interscholastic Activities Association adopted its position on transgender student athletes in January of 2014 and updated them in 2016. While not an NIAA regulation, the guidelines serve as a way to direct member and affiliate schools on the subject. Transgender athletes will be allowed to compete in sanctioned sports in accordance with his or her gender identity, irrespective of the gender listed on the student's birth certificate. I just don't understand that. Like I said, I don't understand this gender identity stuff, but, it's become quite an epidemic in our country. New Hampshire is another state allowing for trans athletes. New Hampshire Interscholastic Athletic Association, the NHIAA, allows transgender students to participate when the student and parents or guardian notify the school in writing at least 2 months prior to the season that they intend to participate in athletics and that the student has a consistent gender identity different than the gender on the student's birth certificate, and lists the sports in which the students would like to participate. The school may use the following criteria to determine whether they can participate in a certain sport. One is the current transcript and school registration information. 2, a written statement from the student affirming the consistent gender identity and expression to which the student self-relates. 3, documentation from individuals such as, but not limited to, parents, friends, and or teachers, which affirm the actions, attitudes, dress, and manner that demonstrate the student's consistent gender identification and expression. 4, written verification from an appropriate healthcare professional. That includes doctors, psychiatrists, or psychologists, of the student's consistent gender identification and expression. 4, medical documentation. That could be hormonal therapy, sexual reassignment surgery, counseling, medical personnel, etc. The policy allows another member school to object and begin a review process of the player's eligibility, but the appeal process allows for input from the student-athlete and their family. New Jersey. The New Jersey State Interscholastic Athletic Association, NJSIAA, transgender policy allows students to participate in a manner consistent with the student's gender identity. In a 2022 update, the policy now mentions non-binary student-athletes and details the options for their participation. Transgender students will be eligible to participate in accordance with either their birth sex or in accordance with their gender identity, but not both. Let's see. The New Mexico Activities Association updated to now 2019 policy that states participating students are required to compete in the gender listed on their original or amended birth certificate. New York. New York State Public High School Athletic Association has passed guidelines stating that students wishing to participate in sports and parents or guardians must notify the superintendent and athletic director of the district if a student has a gender identity different from what is listed on their birth certificate. The school will use gender identity. The school will use gender identity used for school registration and other purposes. Medical documentation and gender identity-related advantage for approved participation to determine a student's eligibility. The guidelines will allow transgender students to participate if the school follows the New York State Public High School Athletic Association guidelines. Schools are not required to follow the recommendation of allowing trans athletes to participate in accordance with their gender identity. New York City, of course, has their own set of rules. New York City's Department of Education includes protections for both gender identity and gender expression in its statement on discrimination and harassment. On March the 10th, 2014, the New York City Department of Education announced specific protections for transgender students. Regarding athletics, their policy calls for inclusion with case-by-case review for competitive activities and contact sports. It also does not require schools to allow students to use facilities in accordance with their gender identity. I guess that's one blessing if you have a sane school administrator and not someone from the woke crowd. This is a quote, transgender students are to be provided the same opportunities to participate in physical education as are all other students. Generally, students will be permitted to participate in physical education and sports in accordance with the student's gender identity that is consistently asserted at school. Participation in competitive athletic activities and contact sports will be resolved on a case-by-case basis. North Carolina. Prior to 2023, the North Carolina High School Athletic Association allowed students to participate according to their gender identity, pending a review. In a case where a student's identity does not match their birth certificate, they may submit a gender identity request form to compete in sports in the gender they identify with and live their lives as. In 2023, a state law was changed to ban participation of transgender athletes. North Dakota. a state law passed there in 2023 banning participation of the trans athletes. The North Dakota High School Athletic Association, however, their policy says a transgender student who is not taking hormone treatment related to gender transition may participate in a sex-separated interscholastic contest in accordance with the sex assigned to him or her at birth. The following clarifies participation in sex-separated interscholastic contests of transgender students undergoing hormonal treatment for gender transition. A trans male, that's a female-to-male student, who has undergone treatment with testosterone for gender transition may compete in a contest for boys, but is no longer eligible to compete in a contest for girls. A trans female, that's male-to-female student, being treated with testosterone suppression medication for gender transition may continue to compete in a contest for boys, but may not compete in a contest for girls until completing 1 calendar year of documented testosterone suppression treatment. Ohio. The Ohio High School Athletic Association, OHSAA, policy states a transgender female or male-to-female transgender student-athlete who is taking medically prescribed hormone treatment related to gender transition may participate on a boys' team at any time. However, before a transgender female can compete in a girls' sport or on a girls' team, the transgender female must either 1. have completed a minimum of 1 year of hormone treatment related to gender transition, or 2, demonstrate to the Commissioner's Office by way of sound medical evidence that the transgender female student-athlete does not possess physical, such as bone structure, muscle mass, testosterone, hormonal, etc., or physiological advantages over genetic females of the same age group. A transgender male or female-to-male transgender student-athlete who has not yet begun medically prescribed testosterone treatment for purposes of gender transition may compete on a boys' team. If the transgender male student-athlete is taking medically prescribed testosterone treatment, he can participate on a boys' team but must have his hormone levels checked regularly. Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Secondary School Activities Association, OSSAA, has a policy going into effect on July the 1st that allows, it went into effect on July the 1st, that allows athletic eligibility of transgender student-athletes based on certain guidelines that center around medical therapy from a licensed physician. The OSSAA's policy requires male to female students to compete at least 1 year of hormone therapy before being allowed to participate in girls' teams. Oregon. The Oregon School Athletic Association, OSAA, policy states that transgender students may participate in the category associated with their gender identity without restrictions. Gender fluid and non-binary youth may participate in the category they choose, but may not change that category during the season. That's insanity, I'm sorry. Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic Association, Inc., has a policy on mixed gender participation, which includes some phrasing about transgender students. However, the policy allows a school principal to make the final decision about what gender a student is and which teams they may play on, without outlining any criteria for the decision-making process. Sorry there, I lost my mind for just a moment. The Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic Association, PIAA, has a policy on mixed gender participation, which includes some phrasing about transgender students. However, the policy allows a school's principal to make the final decision about what gender a student is and which team they may play on, without outlining any criteria for the decision-making process. The policy says where a student's gender is questioned or uncertain, the PIAA will accept the principal's decision as to a student's gender. That seems a little bit strange. But, that's just me maybe, but do you trust your school's principal to, look at your child and decide whether they're male or female? While this wording does encourage school districts to be proactive about making policies for trans participation, it does not guide the school district in any direction and still allows one person, the principal, to make a decision about a player's eligibility. Rhode Island. The Rhode Island Interscholastic League, RIIL, policy says the RIIL recognizes the value of participation in interscholastic sports for all member schools, student athletes. The Rhode Island Interscholastic League is committed to providing all student athletes with equal opportunities to participate in athletic programs consistent with their gender identities. The policy addresses eligibility determinations for students who have a gender identity that is different from the gender listed on their official birth certificates. South Carolina, the South Carolina High School League policy states all students should have the opportunity to participate in South Carolina High School League activities in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity, irrespective of the gender listed on a student's records. The South Carolina did pass a new law in 2022 banning that participation based on sexual identity. The South Dakota also passed a law in 2021 that bans participation, but the South Dakota High School Activities Association policy states all students should have the opportunity to participate in South Dakota High School Activities Association activities in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity, irrespective of the gender listed on a student's records. Again, we have this clash between state law and school policy. We have got to get to the point where our school policies line up with our laws. Okay, Tennessee. State law passed in 2021 bans participation. But the Tennessee Secondary School Activities Association has no policy on transgender athlete participation. In May of 2021, Governor Bill Lee signed a law requiring student athletes' gender for purposes of participation in athletic events to be determined by their original birth certificates. The law applies to public high school and middle schools, but it does exclude grades K through 4. Texas, they passed a law in 2021 banning participation on for the transgender athletes on the opposite sex. But the University Interscholastic League uses a student's birth certificate to determine a student athlete's gender for participation in sports. On October the 25th, 2021, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed into law HB 25, which allows student athletes participating in interscholastic sports to participate only in the sports that correspond with the sex listed on their original birth certificate, which is defined as the document issued at or near the time of the student's birth. The University Interscholastic League previously accepted amended birth certificates. This law overrides that policy. A student assigned female at birth may only participate in boys' sports if a corresponding girls' sport is not available, for example, baseball and football. Utah state law passed in 2022 bans participation. The Utah High School Athletic Association policy states a student shall be permitted to participate on a gender-specific sports team that is consistent with the public gender identity of that student for all other purposes. Okay, Vermont. The Vermont Principals Association Gender Identity Policy states all students should have the opportunity to participate in Vermont Principals Association activities in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity, irrespective of the gender listed on a student's records. Virginia. The Virginia High School League, VHSL, updated its policy in December 2014. The new policy eliminates the strict requirement of sex reassignment surgery, allowing a student to participate in sports if they are verified as having a consistent identity different than the gender listed on the student's official birth certificate or have already begun some form of hormone therapy. The policy emphasizes that the gender identity must be bona fide and requires a process that involves a number of officials verifying that identity. Washington State. The Washington Interscholastic Athletic Association policy says all students should have the opportunity to participate in Washington Interscholastic Athletic Association activities in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity, irrespective of the gender listed on a student's records. The 2013 through 14 handbook details the policies for trans athletes and includes procedures for ensuring access to participation. Washington, D.C. Okay, Washington, D.C. is not a state, but, they do have their own school districts and things of that nature. The District of Columbia State Athletic Association, like I say, it's not a state, but their athletic association supports the process outlined in a download of their policies to address the participation of transgender students in all DCSAA state final series and interscholastic athletics, as it aligns with the D.C. Human Rights Act, Title IX, and other laws and regulations prohibiting discrimination or participation in interscholastic programs and activities sponsored by the DCSAA. Again, that's the District of Columbia State Athletic Association. Quote, all students have the opportunity to participate in DCSAA activities in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity, irrespective of the gender listed on a student's records or identification documents. Schools should allow students to participate in DCSAA activities in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity. It goes on to say, pursuant to 5F DCMR Section 102.6, the DCSAA allows for participation for all students in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity and or expression, regardless of the gender listed on the student's birth certificates. All students should have the opportunity to participate in DCSAA activities in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity, irrespective of the gender listed on a student's records or identification documents. For the purposes of interscholastic activities only, the determination of a student's gender identity shall be made by the student-athlete school after receiving notice from the student-athlete. Schools must allow students to participate in DCSAA activities in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity, including when accessing restrooms and locker room facilities and accommodations when traveling with the team. once the school has been granted eligibility to participate in interscholastic athletics consistent with his or her gender identity, the eligibility is granted for the duration of the student's participation and does not need to be renewed every sports season or school year. Concerning gender-specific sports, a student-athlete is not permitted to switch between gender identity during the sports season or school year for the purpose of interscholastic activities. For example, a student may not participate on the girls' cross-country team and the boys' soccer team during the fall sports season. Student-athletes shall not be permitted to participate in gender-specific sports that are different from their gender identity. For gender-specific sports, an intersex or non-binary student must choose to participate in either boys or girls sports for an entire sports season. An intersex or non-binary student who wants to participate in a different gender-specific sport would need to wait until the following sports season to do so. The DCSAA has established a set of criteria in which student-athletes were able to dispute challenges of their participation in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity as member schools. In a case where an LEA member school does not permit a student to participate because of the student's gender identity or expression, or if a school disputes the participation of a student based on gender, the student may seek a review of eligibility for participation or may appeal an eligibility decision under the procedures coming up here. Notice to the school. The student and or parents or legal guardians shall contact the school administrator and or the school athletic director, indicating that the student has a consistent gender identity different from the gender listed on the student's school registration records, and that the student desires to participate in activities in a manner consistent with their gender identity. The school shall reconsider participation based on this statement. The school staff should work closely with the student to assess the degree to which, if any, the parent or guardian will be involved in the process and must consider the health, well-being, and safety of the appealing student. Why are they leaving the parents out of that? Anyway, notice to DCSAA, if an LEA member school refuses to allow the student to participate, the school administrator shall contact DCSAA, which will assign a facilitator who will assist the school and student in preparation and completion of the mediation process. If the mediation is not successful, the student has a right to appeal. On the appeal, the student may seek a waiver from the athletic appeal panel that is assembled by DCSAA under the waiver procedure to which the parent will apply DC Human Rights Act standards for review. The panel, not the parent, excuse me. The panel shall include a minimum of 3 of the following. I'm sorry, I keep watching a ticker going by here on my computer. The appeal. The student may seek a waiver from the athletic appeal panel that is assembled by DCSAA under the waiver procedure to which the panel will apply DC Human Rights Act standards for review. The panel shall include a minimum of 3 of the following people, one of whom must be from the DCSAA staff. 1, a physician, physician assistant, or a nurse practitioner with transgender health knowledge. 2, a psychiatrist, psychologist, or licensed mental health professional with transgender health knowledge. 3, school administrator from a non-appealing school. And 4, DCSAA staff member. And 5, an advocate familiar with transgender gender identity and gender expression competencies. All documentation generated for the appeal process will remain confidential to protect the privacy of the students. The following documentation and information are required to proceed with the appeal process. All documentation and information shall be submitted directly to DCSAA for panel review. The required documents include documentation of the student's consistent gender identification and a written request to participate in athletics according to their gender identity. For example, affirmed written statements from the student and or school staff and or parent and guardian and or healthcare provider, and to any pertinent documentation or information. Guidelines for the review process say the panel will convene following the waiver procedure and render a decision under those timelines. School Appeals Panel and or DCSAA shall be kept confidential unless consent is granted by the student or the student and his or her family. Okay, the West Virginia. The West Virginia Secondary School Athletics Commission has no policy on transgender athlete participation, but West Virginia did pass laws about that participation and banning, transgender females, from participating in girls' sports. Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Interscholastic Athletic Association policy is based on policies from Washington, Colorado, and the NCAA. Some school districts in Wisconsin have started working towards creating their own policies. Wyoming state law passed in 2023 that bans participation. The Wyoming High School Athletic Association states all students should be considered for the opportunity to participate in Wyoming High School activities association activities in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity, irrespective of the gender listed on a student's records. However, independent review from the member school may be used to make a determination, with one category being balancing the effects of the approval would have on the individual and those other individuals that would be affected by the change. The student's member school will be the first point of determination for the student's eligibility to participate in WHSAA-sanctioned activities. The student and or parent shall notify the school administrator or activities director in writing indicating that the student has a consistent gender identity different than the gender listed on the student's school registration records, and that the student desires to participate in activities in a manner consistent with his or her gender identity. The member school should use the following non-exclusive list of criteria to determine participation. 1. Gender identity from school registration records. 2. Medical documentation, such as hormone therapy, sexual reassignment surgery, counseling, and things for medical personnel, etc. 3, balancing the effects of the approval would have on the individual and those other individuals that would be affected by the change. Now, the National Scholastic Athletics Foundation is the organization responsible for the New Balance Nationals Indoor Track Championships, and the organization uses United States of America Track and Field Policy, which follows the International Olympic Commission policy, which is inappropriate for high school athletes. On February the 26th, 2019, the National Scholastic Athletics Foundation released a statement to announce its transgender athletic policy in advance of the 2019 national championship races. On February the 25th, 2019, different states have adopted different approaches to the eligibility of transgender girls in public education-based sports based on their particular goals for their and extracurricular events. The National Scholastics Athletic Foundation is an independent nonprofit organization dedicated in part to staging national-level elite development events and to providing equal competitive opportunities to boys and girls. We are also a member organization of USA Track and Field and so subject to its rules. Even though our organization's goals are often different from those of public school sports, we are committed to including transgender athletes in our events who have met our requirements so that we can ensure, to the extent possible, fair competition for all entrants. Recognizing the rapidly changing landscape and the different approaches adopted across the country, the NSAF began work on its transgender policy in the spring of 2018. It was finalized in the fall of 2018. Because our focus is elite development sports, harmonization of our rules with those of our sports national governing body, USA Track and Field, was and remains an additional priority. Prepubescent transgender girls are eligible for NSAF competitions based on their affirmed gender, consistent with USATF rules and IOC guidelines. Post-pubescent transgender girls are eligible for NSAF competitions based on their affirmed gender once they have completed a year's course of gender-affirming hormones. So, as you can tell by the various states' actions regarding transgender student participation in sports activity, there is no clear consensus in this country on dealing with transgender athletes. Consequently, the Biden administration was attempting to force the issue by trying to expand the Title IX benefits to transgenders. Schools and colleges across the U.S. would be forbidden from enacting outright bans on transgender athletes under a proposal released by the Biden administration. But teams could create some limits in certain cases, for example, to ensure fairness. This has all been put on hold by the federal courts at the moment, but the proposed rule sends a political counterpunch towards a wave of Republican-led states that have sought to ban trans athletes from competing in school sports that align with their gender identities. If finalized, the proposal would become enshrined as a provision of Title IX, and that was the landmark gender equity legislation enacted in 1972. That was to protect women, It must undergo a lengthy approval process, and it's almost certain to face challenges. While opponents sharply criticized the proposal, some advocates for transgender athletes were concerned that it did not go far enough. The proposal came on the same day that the Supreme Court said a 12-year-old transgender girl in West Virginia can continue competing in her middle school track and cross-country teams while legal battles over the state's transgender law continues. The law, as I reiterated earlier, bans transgender athletes from female teams. Under the Education Department's proposed rules, that's the Federal Education Department, no school or college that receives federal funding would be allowed to impose a one-size-fits-all policy that categorically bans trans students from playing on sports teams consistent with their gender identity. Such policies would be considered a violation of Title IX. Still, the proposal leaves rooms for schools to develop team eligibility rules that could ultimately result in restrictions around the trans athletes' participation. That would be allowed only if it serves an important educational objective, I quote, as a fairness in competition and reduction of injury risks, Any limitations would have to consider the sport, the level of competition, and the age of the students. Elementary school students would generally be allowed to participate in any teams consistent with their gender identity, for example. More competitive teams at high schools and colleges could add limits, but those would be discouraged in teams that don't have tryouts or cuts. Quoting Mr. Biden's education secretary, every student should be able to have the full experience of attending school in America, including participating in athletics free from discrimination. Biden's administration used fairness and competition as a criteria, which has been part of the debate both in the United States and globally, but officials offered no specifics on how this could be done. Of the tens of millions of high school students in the United States, about 300,000 youth between the ages of 13 and 17 identify as transgender, according to a 2022 study from the Williams Institute. That's a think tank at UCLA that is focused on LGBTQ plus issues. The number of athletes within that group is much smaller. A 2017 survey by the Human Rights Campaign suggested fewer than 15% of all transgender youth play sports. Asked about the proposal, Bobby Hirsch, a transgender man and sophomore on the Wayne State men's fencing team, said anything helps. Excuse me. But he feared the language in the rule would make it easier for schools to tell transgender athletes they can't play on a team. That's the direction things have been going, he said in a phone interview. Hirsch competed on the women's team in the 2021-2022 season and began transitioning socially in high school and medically the preceding summer. Eli Bundy, an 18-year-old transgender resident of Charleston, South Carolina, said they welcomed the proposal but were stopping short of celebrating. He said, I have a hard time feeling relief when positive stuff happens at the national level because there's still so much at the state level from the South Carolina legislature that is antagonistic and sends a really harmful message to trans youth, said Bundy. He testified in 2021 against the state's ban on transgender students' participation in girls' and women's sports at public schools and colleges. Asked about the state bans now in place, a senior education department official briefing reporters on condition of anonymity said Title IX is the law of the land and officials would work to ensure it's being followed in all states. But you can see from what I have outlined over the last 2 weeks, states may ban participation based upon gender identity, but school districts are changing rules on their level despite the laws. This is not conducive to an agreed-upon policy throughout all the states. Personally, I would like to dismantle the Department of Education on the federal level and take control back to the state level and demand that the various school districts in a state change their policies to align with the state laws regarding sports and other activities. In a West Virginia case, the Supreme Court refused to undo an appeals court order that made it possible for a girl, it's a trans girl, by the way, Becky Pepper Jackson, to continue playing on her school's teams. The state's law on transgender athletes defines male to female by looking at the student's reproductive biology and genetics at birth. It applies to middle and high school as well as colleges. Elsewhere, Republican lawmakers insisted they had the right to set policies in their states. The Biden administration announcement came a day after Kansas lawmakers succeeded in overriding Democratic Governor Laura Kelly's third veto in 3 years of a bill to ban transgender female athletes from girls and women's sports. At this point, the federal government does the federal government not understand the U.S. Constitution that says we have states' rights? Said Republican State Representative Brenda Landwehr of Wichita. We can make decisions on our own. The NCAA released a statement the other night saying NCAA's current transgender student-athlete participation policy aligns with the Olympic movement and balances fairness, inclusion, and safety for all student-athletes. The policy remains in place while the lengthy Title IX regulatory process plays out. At the same time, international sports governing bodies are instituting policies that effectively ban the vast majority of trans women from track and field and swimming events. Donna Di Verona, a two-time Olympic gold medalist in swimming and a member of the Women's Sports Policy Working Group, said her hope is to find a nuanced approach to finding space for transgender athletes while allowing for Title IX to make sure girls and women have fairness, opportunity, and safety. Sasha Burchett, a Lambda legal senior attorney and director of the group's Non-Binary and Transgender Rights Project, said the proposed rules provided critical recognition of the importance of participation in sports for transgender youth. At the same time, she expressed concern about whether it would eliminate discrimination against transgender students. But an attorney for cisgender runners decried the proposal as a slap in the face to female athletes who deserve equal opportunity to compete in their sport. It went on to say the Biden administration's rewriting Title IX degrades women and tells them that their athletic goals and placements do not matter, said Christina Kiefer, senior counsel of the Alliance Defending Freedom. She represented Connecticut runners who sued over the participation of two transgender girls in track and field events. President Joe Biden's administration has made it a priority to bolster the rights of trans students. Last year, they proposed a separate federal rule that for the first time would extend Title IX rights to the LGBTQ+ students, broadly protecting them from discrimination in education. The new proposal doesn't offer examples of acceptable limits that could be placed on school sports, but it clarifies that restrictions couldn't be directed at trans students only. Schools would be left to navigate that tricky legal terrain with the knowledge that any violation can bring a federal civil rights investigation or lawsuit. Schools that choose to impose limits must minimize harms to students who lose out on athletics opportunities. The proposal says, if a school can achieve objectives like fairness in ways that cause less harm, then the school could be deemed as violating Title IX. Preventing students from participating in a sports team consistent with their gender identity can stigmatize and isolate them, according to background information provided by the administration. This is different from the experience of a student who is not selected for a team based on their skills. Schools that violate Title IX can face penalties up to a complete loss of federal funding, although no schools have ever been dealt that punishment. Fortunately, the change to Title IX has been put on hold by virtue of all the lawsuits currently pending and the Biden administration's concern about it being election year. Title IX was originally passed to address women's rights at schools and colleges receiving federal money. I, like many others, don't want any girl to lose those rights, her right to play a fair playing field or her right to use a safe place to change. Now, the federal government at this point is going off the deep end with regard to these transgender issues. Like I say, they are pushing things that I think the vast majority of people in the United States do not want. And we're seeing that pushback quite dramatically in the various states that are trying to protect our girls and women from the invasion of men who could physically hurt them or whatever the case may be with regard to them taking over a particular sport. We've got to find some way to keep the boys as boys and the girls as girls, and if necessary, find an entire different classification for those transgender individuals for them to play sports that they want to play. Anyway, we're going to next week we're going to look at the way the federal government has been pushing the transgender policies in this country, and especially with regard to WPATH. So, in the meantime, if you would like to donate to Trials and Triumphs to help offset the costs associated with research, you may do so via Cash App or Venmo to Ladina Boo. That's LADENA BOUGH. I also suggest you download the Live 365 app and make MTM Broadcasting your favorite station. I'll bid you goodbye for now and look forward to visiting with you again next week. Stay blessed. Goodbye.
To contact Trials and Triumphs, you can email Pastor Ladina Boo at trialsandtriumphs2@gmail.com. For more information, find Trials and Triumphs on Facebook and her podcast on Buzzsprout, as well as X under and Trials 56454 or Instagram under Pastor Ladina Boo.
This is MTM Broadcasting, your classic Christian station.
I'm Michelle in Indiana.
This is Jeremy in Fort Worth, Texas.
Hi, this is Mary in Colorado.
This is Tiffany in Nixon, Missouri.
And I listen to
The Cup of Joe
Morning show on MTM Broadcasting
at MTN